Can do is more than just an attitude. Can do is extraordinary support in extraordinary times. It's the knowledge and expertise to harness opportunities. Can do is empowering you to get your plans back on track. Can do is Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management. Visit candowealth.com to see how we can help you build your wealth with confidence. Investment involves risk and you may not get back what you invest. It's not suitable for everyone.
Hello, Unwrappers. Olly here. Before we get going, I just want to let you know about the Week magazine's Jubilee sale. It is a right royal excuse to relax and reflect on the last 7 days, with news and opinion curated from over 200 trusted sources. Subscribe by Sunday, the 5th of June, and you'll enjoy your first 7 issues for free. That is £31.43 worth of excellent issues of the magazine for free, just for listening to this podcast. And the Week magazine will leave you feeling fully informed on the issues that matter. Visit theweek.co.uk and enter the code JUBILEE to claim your free trial. That's theweek.co.uk/JUBILEE. And now, on with the show. It's the week ending Saturday the 4th of June, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen a 4-day bank holiday weekend in Britain to celebrate the Queen's Platinum Jubilee, Australia's Labour Party securing an outright majority after the final counts from the general election, and the death of legendary jockey Lester Piggott at the age of 86. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team is Julia O'Driscoll. From Goal, we have to take it one game at a time, it's Emma Smith. And star of the Retrospectors podcast, it says here. I might ask my agent to have some words about that. It's Arion McNicoll. And Arion, the star, the legend, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
So this week we learnt that when it comes to the UK's upcoming gambling review, all bets are off.
So today, we're launching the first part of our comprehensive review of the Gambling Act. Nearly half of the adult population gambles each month, and for the majority of people, gambling is a fun and carefree leisure activity. It's also a sector that supports 100,000 jobs and pays nearly £3 billion a year in taxes. However, we know that in some cases, gambling can cause significant damage to people's lives, including mental health problems, relationship breakdown, debt, and in extreme cases, suicide.
Nigel Huddleston, Minister for Sport, Tourism and Heritage, me neither, announcing the Gambling Act review in the House of Commons. Now, that was back in 2020. Arion, what's happened this week?
So in a few weeks' time, the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, the DCMS, will publish a review of the UK's gambling legislation, which dates back 17 years. But according to reports that came out this week, UK ministers are in the process of watering down their plans for what was meant to be a real crackdown on the country's betting giants. And it's expected that there's going to be 2 big changes.
And what were the original intentions that are allegedly being watered down?
Okay, well, there were 2 big things that had been expected that now look like they're not going to be in this white paper. The first was the introduction of a so-called user pays levy on betting firms to fund addiction prevention and research. So the kinds of things to make people who have gambling problems get the kinds of support they need. And second, Premier League football clubs were expected to be forced to remove gambling sponsors from the fronts of their shirts. And now both of those measures are expected to be diluted, if not shelved altogether. So what was being billed as the biggest shakeup in advertising since tobacco promotion was outlawed is now looking decidedly more meek, really.
And Julia, I'm going to ask you a question to which I imagine the answer is money, but why? Why might they be watering these plans down?
Well, there you go, Olly. You've answered it yourself. The Betting and Gambling Council has warned that, introducing a mandatory levy would tip a third of Britain's casinos into loss, threatening nearly 3,000 jobs. And obviously, this is after the pandemic, where lots of brick and mortar casinos have suffered huge losses just from the lack of footfall too.
But Emma, 3,000 jobs against a regulated betting industry in this country that supports 119,000 jobs doesn't really seem that many when you compare it to the amount of families that are affected by the problems of problem gambling.
Absolutely. It's a growing issue. And I mean, working in sport and working in football as I do, it's something that you hear a lot about and which is pretty prevalent. I mean, you mentioned Premier League clubs, the sponsorship. 10 out of the 20 Premier League clubs in 2021-22 had a betting firm as a sponsor, 9 as their main shirt sponsor. Aston Villa had a betting firm as a sleeve sponsor, a secondary sponsor. So it's a business which is sort of overarching, and in terms of the industry that I work in, and there's a constant issue. Like you hear also, there've been so many stories of young men, primarily, the stereotypical football fan, having their lives blighted by gambling addiction and gambling issues, which have led in some, as Nigel Huddleston mentioned in his speech there, have led in the most extreme cases to deaths, to suicides. So on the one hand, you obviously have the issue, obviously people's jobs at risk, but at the same time, it's quite a clinical way of looking at it. But you have a few hundred jobs on the line versus thousands of innocent lives which have been blighted by gambling addiction. And it seems as if to choose the former over the latter seems a little bit short-sighted from the government.
But it sounds like from what you're saying, Emma, that the money from the gambling companies is underpinning a lot of football in this country. So maybe those figures of jobs that would be lost doesn't include all of the football clubs and all the other organisations that benefit from that sponsorship. And it actually could be a larger number of people than we think. It
could be. But then again, gambling companies, it's one of the most profitable industries in Britain. According to Gamble Aware, just a 1% tax on gambling firms could raise up to £140 million, which could be put towards research into helping people with problem gambling, going into victim support. So even a very small tax, even a very small levy on these companies would have a huge benefit. And the idea that levy is now going to be optional rather than mandatory, I mean, you can't imagine maybe in an ideal world, some of these companies will opt into it as a goodwill gesture. But the fact is, making it optional rather than mandatory just opens such a giant loophole that it makes the whole sort of like the supposed crackdown seem so watered down to be almost pointless.
There are those, Julio, who point to other countries in Europe and say, well, they have a more tightly regulated betting industry than us, and actually what it's done is push people to the black market instead. So is that really better?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting question. I was looking at kind of how the UK's attitudes towards gambling compares to other European nations, and it's generally seen that the UK has a slightly more mainstream attitude towards it, whereas in other countries it's more tightly regulated. The ages at which you can gamble are also higher. So, for example, in Belgium, the legal age for gambling is 21 compared to here, where for most types of gambling it's 18, but from 16 people can start dipping their toes in with, buying lottery tickets, scratch cards, that kind of thing. And of course, while this legislation, in whatever form it does come into effect, watered down or not so much, inevitably restrictions on gambling activities will push people towards the black market. And at that point, we're looking at a complete loss of regulation, no support for people who are kind of really at that point, probably at their most vulnerable and most at risk. And I think that's a really significant issue that could potentially be overlooked.
For people who aren't at risk, though, Arion, I suppose you can see the point of view that this is just a bit intrusive, for example, showing your pay slips to be able to go and place a bet. For people who don't have a gambling addiction issue and are from middle-class homes and have a healthy bank balance but don't want to have to disclose that when they go and put £100 on a horse, you can sort of see why they'd feel like their liberty was being impinged by stricter restrictions.
I think there's truth in that. And when you look at the other measures that may be in the white paper, you've got a bunch of things that are there to protect people who are vulnerable, which, you're right, could end up being annoying for anyone who isn't in a vulnerable position in relation to how they gamble. So, for example, one of the measures that sounds particularly useful is a thing called an affordability check, which is similar to the kind of credit check you get when you apply for a mortgage. And those would be carried out on people who are found to be losing thousands of pounds to gambling. But I think that's the important point. If it goes through in that way, if that's what the recommendation is, and if that's what's adopted, then it's not going to touch the sorts of people who aren't losing thousands of pounds. It's just going to be there as a safety net for those who are. There was another important measure, which is that the government is thinking about introducing maximum stakes of between £2 and £5, we don't know yet, for gamblers using online slot machines. And that seems like a really useful limit in itself, though again, I don't see how that will stop people from losing masses of money. One of the big problems with gambling at the moment is that everyone's got now a casino in their pocket because we're carrying around the kinds of technology that will let us get to gambling from anywhere at any time of day, whereas bricks and mortar casinos have to close down. So I think really the most likely thing is that this review will not really impact people whose lives aren't being damaged by gambling. And so I don't think there is a great threat there. I think this is, if it goes through the way we hope it will go through, and what the nervousness is that it's not going to have many strong enough prohibitions and limitations in the first place, then it will just help those people who need help.
Yeah, I mean, this is the crucial point, isn't it, Emma? And why it's kind of crazy that the regulations haven't changed for so long, which is that when the new Labour government loosened the restrictions on gambling, which in itself was criticised because it opened up the high street to casino-style gambling, but nonetheless, it was based on the idea of being in a place. Whereas now we do have this situation where particularly sports fans, particularly those being advertised at, particularly young ones, are just able to gamble all day long.
Yeah, and are actively encouraged to do so. I mean, if you watch any television coverage of any sport, you will have gambling adverts before kickoff, halftime, afterwards. You had like sort of the Ray Winston adverts, which became basically a meme, like the bet in play now kind of stuff. It is sort of, it's constant encouragement that if you are a sports fan, if you are a young male who are the primary target for this, it is the done thing to gamble. And so, you have people being targeted. But the fact is that it's, as you say, the prevalence of the availability to gamble, on our phones, on the high street, it makes it so easy. And the fact is, you mentioned about sort of people with middle class incomes with supposed financial cushions. Gambling addiction can be such a ravenous disease almost that it can affect almost anyone. There was a piece in the Telegraph this week, quite heartbreaking sort of first person piece by Jennifer Housey, in which she talked about how her husband was a secret gambler and eventually the family lost their home. They lost hundreds of thousands of pounds through gambling addiction. The fact is that if addiction goes unchecked, if it goes unregulated, they can claim lives no matter how much of a financial barrier you're supposed to have. And the idea that this is now could well be rowed back from is quite worrying.
Julia, politically, this follows the government's U-turn on curbing those buy one, get one free offers on food as well, junk food regulation, that it was the Conservative Party, George Osborne, etc., who tried to bring in. And this time again, you're seeing a review that was kickstarted by the Conservative Party, seemingly about to be U-turned on by the Conservative Party. It seems to me like Boris Johnson trying to signal that yes, his administration has put lots of public money into things during COVID, but he is an anti-nanny state Tory.
Yeah, it's a great point, Ollie. I mean, the Conservative Party had to address this. It was a 2019 election pledge that they would. And so once the ball was rolling, it had to be. But the legislation has been kind of pushed down the line, delayed and delayed. And in the meantime, more than one person a day commits suicide from gambling addiction in the UK. And so each kind of month of delay is just costing more and more lives. And that's where the real tragedy here is that, if this was an election pledge that was supposed to win over voters, but the reality is that actually it's not a priority for the Conservative Party, lives are being lost and this problem could just get worse.
I think that's really important. The way that we've seen the Conservative Party come at so many of these kinds of issues is that they say all the right things in anticipation of whatever it is, the review or the emerging piece of legislation that's coming up. But then the closer we get to the actual potential law change, the more it gets either watered down or kicked down the road or abandoned altogether. And, when you consider the things that have been asked for as the sort of ambit claim from campaigners, including they've suggested a total ban on gambling in advertising in sport so that we can prevent the kinds of things that Emma was talking about there. There's just this wall-to-wall coverage of how you can place your bets as a game unfolds. And also the end to VIP schemes. When you haven't gambled for a while, the gambling company of your preference gets in touch and says, hey, we haven't seen you for a little bit. Here's £200 in your account. How about you come back and effectively lose more money to us? I think that if you consider that those are sort of the points at which activists would like to see change, and we're coming quite a few steps further away from that, it's obvious that every bit of dilution, and also, as Julia was saying, every delay is significant, not just in the money that it's losing people, but also, as Julia was saying, the lives that are being lost.
Yeah, well, whilst the government is still waiting to report on this, if you are affected by this issue or someone that you love is addicted to gambling, do check out GamStop, GAMSTOP, which is the self-exclusion scheme you can join right now. Okay, Julia, you'll be up next after this.
Can Do is more than just an attitude. Can Do is extraordinary support in extraordinary times. It's the knowledge and expertise to harness opportunities. Can Do is empowering you to get your plans back on track. Can Do is Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management. Visit candowealth.com to see how we can help you build your wealth with confidence. Investment involves risk and you may not get back what you invest. It's not suitable for everyone.
Right, Julia, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
A transatlantic talk that's turned into a flying shame.
So here's the thing. Mayors, city leaders, we haven't got time for abstract debates or merely flowery declarations. Our populations want change today. They want change yesterday. The climate crisis we're in demands leadership. And mayors I meet around the world are stepping up into that space to meet the moment.
Mayor of Bristol, Marvin Rees, and his recent TED Talk, How is Your City Tackling the Climate Crisis? Julia, often we play clips from TED Talks and it's just to illustrate a story, but in this instance, the TED Talk is the story.
It is indeed. So that TED Talk was released last week and it's had thousands of views already in a number of days. But what's happened is that since it's been released, news has come out that Rees took a flight to Canada where this talk was filmed. So his office say that during this trip to Canada, he had a very full schedule, many meetings, and it was, not only planned to deliver this TED Talk, but climate campaigners aren't happy. Flight Free UK has calculated the carbon that the trip has cost, about 2 tons of CO2. And basically, he's now being accused of being a climate hypocrite.
And is he a climate hypocrite, Julia?
It's a tricky one. I think when I first saw this, I thought, oh dear, shouldn't have done it.
Because it looks bad. Like the newsline is bad. Man flies around the world to tell people not to fly.
Exactly. But when you actually listen to the TED Talk and look at what Marvin Rees has done as Mayor of Bristol, he's made really significant headway in terms of, addressing the climate crisis. He was the first mayor to declare a climate crisis back in 2018, and he's hoping that Bristol will be carbon neutral by 2030. So when you look at kind of what he has achieved and what he hopes to achieve, and then this kind of criticism and headline, it's quite disappointing.
Okay, so Julia's argument there, Emma, is that Rees has sort of built up his own offsetting by doing lots of environmental projects at home. That justifies him taking an international flight to tell people about climate change. Do you agree, or is he a hypocrite?
I do agree to some extent that he has done a lot as Mayor of Bristol, but the fact is that flying 9 hours to Vancouver to give a 14-minute TED Talk about cutting climate emissions, as you say, is not a great look. And particularly, we are in 2022, we are in a world where doing these kind of talks on Zoom, on these talks remotely, is now almost the norm. It is almost the accepted method. So the fact is that giving that talk remotely without having to fly would have been almost more powerful and would have made a more viable point than flying all the way to Vancouver to give this talk.
Well, would it, Arion? I mean, if the mayor of Bristol set up a webcam in his offices in the West Country, would it have attracted the same global audience that look at him with full makeup on and the stage mic and the stage lights on the TED stage with Bill Gates and all the rest of it? I mean, that happens in Vancouver. That's where it is.
I completely agree with that. I think that look back to COP26 and there were plenty of these headlines. You had like 400 private jets carrying world leaders and business executives coming in to do this thing, talk to each other. But I do think it's hugely important. I think, first of all, as you say, the way that the message is delivered matters. And also, I think there's a lot of interpersonal stuff that can happen when people whose voices actually matter on a particular subject get together in person. And, Rees had a very full agenda apart from delivering this TED talk. He met various people from Vancouver who he needed to meet. But I think that when we talk about this whole business of whether people can fly to deliver arguments against flying and the importance of not emitting too much carbon, it's important not to be too reductive in how we approach that argument. The assumption that people tend to make is that the best way to reduce carbon emissions is through changes to our personal behavior. But the most significant reductions we all know come about through the kinds of political activity that transform those systems that drive pollution up. And that's exactly what Rees had gone there to try to do. So I think that, what matters is what you're doing with your carbon rather than whether you're emitting any carbon at all. And, for example, I was thinking about the following hypothetical. What if a particular activist spent a full year flying around the world, thus being responsible, obviously, for loads of CO2 emissions, but in the end, that activist secured an agreement by all the countries in the world to commit to net zero emissions by, pick a year, 2030. Obviously, that would be a really good use of that person's time and carbon. And so it was, in my view, with Rees, and so it was, frankly, with everyone who came to COP26.
We're in this weird situation now, Julia, where basically there's no shame in flying if you don't care about climate change. Like, no one says cancel your holiday because of climate change in the mainstream. And yet, if you do care about climate change, then you should never get on a plane. You're a hypocrite. But I mean, surely it's better to fly so that you can try and achieve a reduction in climate change than not fly at all.
Yeah, when Arion was just describing that hypothetical climate campaigner, all I could think of was Alok Sharma taking flights to, I think it was more than 30 countries in the lead up to COP26. And that obviously was headline news. Lots of fingers were pointed. At the same time, he was spearheading, a landmark climate agreement that, was much anticipated and has been called as our last chance to really change the tide on the climate crisis. In terms of thinking about individuals, I think that's the problem with these kind of headlines and the call out culture is that, nobody's perfect. Some people want to do their bit for the environment, but they can't necessarily do everything. And to feel like you're falling at the first hurdle just isn't helpful. I thought it was also quite interesting that the Flight Free UK campaign group that have called out Marvin Rees has more Twitter followers than it has people who've actually pledged to sign up to go flight free this year. So
hypocrites.
It just raises the question of, is this really helpful for anyone?
Well, that's it. And that stat that you quoted, Emma, which is sort of accurate but not true, if you like, that Marvin Rees flew 9 hours to Canada to give a 14-minute talk. That is how news organisations have reported this in this sort of knowingly naive way, because they're playing into call-out culture, because they want a simple label on it. So is the responsibility on us, I mean, you guys really as journalists rather than us listening, is the responsibility on journalists to be more responsible about the way that's presented rather than seeking clickbait around this?
Yeah, I mean, and that's just, you could apply that to pretty much any story. It's of course, you should attempt to, when you're reporting on a story, to tell it accurately. And certainly, to say that he did fly 9 hours to Vancouver to give a 40-minute talk is a little bit reductive. I mean, the flight free movement is kind of idealistic without sort of having this sort of basis in what the reality of things like the meeting in Vancouver are, and about the realities of a global society in which leaders are like people are needed to go to these events around the world in which the fact is going completely flight free just isn't a viable option for some people in certain circumstances. I mean, on the website Flight Free UK sort of talks about how the flight free movement began in Sweden in 2016, and I mean, the fact is that that's sort of been more about pushing people away from taking flights for sort of travel and holidays and sort of taking a holiday at home rather than flying abroad. That's a good message to send. An unhelpful message to send is calling out someone who is clearly an environmentalist for flying to this important event to give an important speech. There's a way of getting your message across and making a good point about going flight free. I don't think this story is necessarily it.
And just thinking about messages, I think it's also important to look at the substance of what Ruiz was talking about. And he was saying that cities are a really good place to start addressing the climate crisis itself. And it seems like a really important point to be making, either from his home in Bristol or from Vancouver. Either will do. But I think, thinking about the way that for years, the focus of the world's response to climate change has been on nation states, which haven't been terribly good at brokering the kinds of comprehensive agreements that we need. Whereas cities are increasingly proving themselves to be really good at doing the sorts of risk assessments and setting out greenhouse gas emissions targets and pledging to act and then following through on those pledges. I saw a piece by Nature magazine calling cities the first responders in the climate crisis, and it really feels like that's where we're getting. And some of the individual innovations that Rees highlighted in his TED talk, he talked about, this district heat network in Malmö in Sweden, which uses geothermal energy to reduce fossil fuels, and subsidies in Oslo for electric vehicles, and then planting new urban gardens in Singapore. These are cities that are doing the kinds of things that are going to make the difference we need, that states are sort of splutteringly, only limitedly managing to ease towards. So the substance of his message matters. How we get it, I can see why there's question marks over the business of how he got there or whatever, but we do need to focus on the substance of his talk as well.
Is it quite an English attitude, though, Julia? Maybe that, he's getting a bit big for his boots and he's flying all around the world. He's not a national figure even in England. He's a big deal in Bristol, but the people of Bristol have recently voted in a referendum to abolish his post. So it seems like the signal from Bristol is, admittedly only a minority of people voted in that referendum, but nonetheless, local people don't want their representatives being international figures. They want them here and getting on with it.
I know it did feel a little bit disheartening reading that, for all that Marvin Rees has achieved in his tenure as mayor of Bristol, the post is now being abolished, and so he won't be in position, and no mayor will be in position to see out that 2030 target. It might be the case that, people felt maybe he was getting a bit too big for his boots. I think probably more he was using a platform to really convey a message that he clearly is passionate and committed about. And, I think that's quite, which if anything, it would have been a bad idea to turn down given the urgency of the situation at hand.
Okay, Emma, you're our showstopper for today, our Top Gun. You're up next after this. Okay, Emma, you are finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This week we felt the need to go back to the cinema.
Let me be perfectly blunt. You are not my first choice. You were here at the request of Admiral Kazansky, a.k.a. Iceman. He seems to think that you have something left to offer the Navy. What that is, I can't imagine.
With all due respect, sir, I'm not a teacher. Just want to manage expectations.
Ah, yes, we're in the danger zone. Top Gun Maverick, out now in cinemas. Emma, talk to me, Goose.
So this week, figures released on Monday revealed that the new movie Top Gun Maverick has given Tom Cruise his first ever $100 million opening weekend at the US box office, which, considering that Tom Cruise has been acting since 1981, is quite astonishing.
Yeah, and he doesn't generally make art house movies.
No, absolutely not. His previous biggest opening weekend was $64 million for War of the Worlds, $64 million in the US. So this has
Paltry.
been exactly. And this has been a quite remarkable success cinematically. The worldwide box office for the opening weekend of Top Gun Maverick was $248 million or £196 million, outperforming all expectations.
Okay, outperforming expectations, but still not surprising necessarily, given the huge international appeal of Top Gun over decades and the appetite for action movies, franchises. Why is this your story of the week?
The reason why this is my story of the week is because it indicates a desire to return to the cinema after COVID closures and a shift away from home viewing and streaming for new releases. In the last 2 years, worldwide cinematic box office has unsurprisingly taken a huge hit. In China, the cinema industry has lost approximately $5 billion. The box office takings for cinemas have gone massively downhill in 2020. The top film, which was an anime film, grossed $503 million worldwide. It was the first time since 2007 that the top grossing film had failed to breach the $1 billion mark. And basically, during the last 2 years, plenty of obituaries have been written about the future of cinema, about how that sort of experience is going to become archaic and how home viewing and streaming is the way forwards.
Does that, Julia, though, indicate that there is actually a decline in appetite to stream at home because Top Gun Maverick isn't available to stream at home? So, I mean, if you say that the opening window is you have to go to the cinema to see it and it's something that's hugely anticipated, does that mean cinema's doing well, or is Hollywood just basically blackmailing people to go and watch it first in the cinema?
Yeah, it's a good question. I saw that Paramount had put like loads of money obviously behind the marketing of this film, but also that it had released it in more cinemas than it has for any other film for a really significant number of years. So, there's been a massive drive behind it. And also, I think the marketing machines and distribution teams that maybe slowed down during the pandemic are just back up to full pelt and are really getting into their groove now. But I do think the timing is significant given that I think it was last month Netflix saw a drop in subscribers of about 200,000, which may not sound like a lot of people given the millions of Netflix viewers it does have. But I do think that the timing is interesting given that, our viewing habits are changing and actually maybe people do want to get back out and go to the cinema and get away from the TV screens they've been locked to for the last 18 months, 2 years.
Yes, but is this slightly a special case, Arion, given the size and scale as well of what you're seeing? It makes sense to see Top Gun on the biggest screen you can find.
I think so. The Atlantic said, it's not narratively complex, but as a standalone blockbuster that's just trying to suck viewers' eyeballs out of their sockets with hellacious flight photography and thunderous sound, Maverick is just what every Cineplex in the country has been crying out for. And I think that's, from what I understand, I haven't seen it yet, that is the draw. It's got this incredible soundtrack, it's got this amazing cinematography, and also it's just purely a kind of visceral experience. We've almost the trademark of Tom Cruise these days has become watching him do crazy things and amazing stunts in his films. And this is him again pulling that trick, going up in these amazing machines and doing it himself. It's not a film that massively depends on CGI. It's a sort of in-person experience. And I think that, for those other studios who are hoping that this is a sign of things to come, and certainly we've got big releases lined up in the form of, say, Universal's Jurassic World Dominion, which comes along this month, and Disney's Lightyear, which is a quite interesting looking sequel in the Toy Story series. Will they be able to deliver the same sort of thing as what Top Gun is doing? It remains to be seen, I think.
But it also has nostalgia, Emma, doesn't it? This is about people reliving their youth to an extent, isn't it? Just as, in fact, those other films that Arion mentioned will give people 90s and noughties nostalgia. This is about the 80s, isn't it? Everything's present and correct. It's exactly as you remember it.
Yeah, certainly that seems to be one of the biggest draws. The fact that it's a Tom Cruise Top Gun film with huge action sequences, cheesy dialogue, all that kind of stuff. It's exactly what you want at the cinema. But the fact is that this film has been one of the most heavily affected by COVID. It was due to release in May 2020. So it's been delayed by 2 full years. And it was actually both Cruise and producer Jerry Bruckheimer. This was both of their requests. They both refused to release the film to streaming over the last 2 years. Cruise recently appeared at the Cannes Film Festival and was asked about this, and he said, "I make films for the big screen. I spent a lot of time with theatre owners. The people who serve the popcorn, this is a film for them." And so clearly there's been an awareness of this is a film to get people back to the cinema. And the fact is, over the last 2 years, we have seen a lot of films which would seemingly be designed for the big screen released on streaming. Warner Brothers during 2021 released their entire slate of films simultaneously in cinemas and on demand. This included films like Wonder Woman 1984, Godzilla vs. Kong, films which seem designed to be seen on the biggest screen possible, a giant lizard and a giant monkey beating seven bells out of each other. Yeah, it was released, a lot of people would have seen that on their phone screen. And that could have easily happened with Top Gun Maverick.
We've also seen this backward step, Julia, with the Oscars, who are now removing their pandemic rule, which allowed streaming releases to qualify for Academy Awards. It will now, I understand, no longer be the case.
Yes, exactly. So now films will have to be released in cinemas for them to be eligible for Oscars nominations, which does feel like a bit of a backstep. I think it was quite an exciting opportunity to kind of potentially diversify the pool of films that might make that, most coveted list. And it does just feel a bit of a shame. But at the same time, I'm sure many across the industry are really pleased at the news, and I'm sure it's going to do wonders for box office sales across a number of films.
It seems to me irreversible, though, Arion, this streaming thing we've all been through for the past few years. I mean, okay, it might be evening out a little bit now, but you can't put it back in the bottle, can you? People hear about a film, they want to see it as soon as possible. Okay, for Top Gun, that's on the big screen, but there's that demand appetite there now.
I think that's right. During the pandemic, if you look at the high-performing films, they were kind of designed for younger audiences. You had things like Spider-Man No Way Home and Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness and the new Batman film. These were the kinds of films that could appeal to the sorts of people who, A, didn't want their social lives cancelled, and B, felt that the pandemic wasn't such a threat to them personally, whereas something like Top Gun Maverick has that, as you say, nostalgia factor built into it, and so it is designed to appeal to a sort of older blockbuster aficionado as well as the younger audience. Although interestingly, apparently the biggest single audience is still the 18 to 24 year old age group, though maybe that's not that interesting. That's always been the blockbuster kind of target. But I think that the genie is out of the bottle on this one. I think that we are going to continue to see films released in different ways. And for me, the Academy has to catch up with that.
It feels a bit like every possible 70s, 80s, 90s franchise has been rebooted, but is there anything left, I wonder? Arion, is there something that you would like to see back that hasn't yet been dredged up from the dead?
Inspector Gadget?
I think that was done about 20 years ago, wasn't it?
Yeah, there was that awful Matthew Broderick film, so do it again, but properly this time.
Yeah, exactly.
Emma, do you have a title you'd like to see again?
I'm a child of the 90s, so there was a Pokemon film, live action Pokemon film, which was released about 5 years ago, which was I actually very much enjoyed in my very nerdy sort of way. So I'd like to see more of that.
So I'd like to see a Pokemon spin-off. Okay, and Julia?
I already know that I am going to regret saying this, but I would not be adverse to Pretty Woman 2.
Right.
Prettier Woman.
Okay, well, Pretty Woman 2. Big mistake. Big. Huge. With which, my thanks to Julia, Arion, and Emma for their stories this week. You can follow this show for free. No need to head to your multiplex. You can get every episode as soon as it's released by searching for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts and tapping follow. I've been Olly Iceman. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer, Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, whoosh!